Today, we will learn English through listening and improve ourselves through the story of a samurai. This story is about Hiroshi, a disciplined warrior who trained both his sword and his mind with patience, focus, and effort. By listening carefully, you'll practice English vocabulary, pronunciation, and sentence structure, while also learning the value of discipline and persistence. Just as Hiroshi grew stronger day by day, we can become better learners and better people through steady effort and attention. Let's begin. The silent morning. In the gray light before dawn, the samurai Hiroshi rose from his mat without a sound. His home was simple: bamboo walls, a paper door, a single sword resting on a stand. He did not need more. Discipline was the center of his life, as steady as the mountain beyond his village. Every morning, he followed the same rhythm. He bowed to the east, washed his face with cold water, and began his kata. The movements were not for battle alone. They were a language of patience. His breath matched the swing of his blade, and through repetition, his mind grew sharp. Hiroshi's teacher had once told him, "A samurai without order is a blade without a sheath." He carried those words through years of training, through hunger, snow, and loneliness. Now, at 35, Hiroshi lived by his own rule: to master the smallest things first, the breath, the step, the word, before reaching for greatness. When the sun rose, he wrote short poems to test his clarity of thought. His handwriting was neat, almost sacred. Then, after a small meal of rice and tea, he began his new challenge: learning the language of the Western world, English. To Hiroshi, this was another battlefield. Letters felt like swords he could not yet wield. He copied them slowly, line after line, whispering their sounds. Sometimes his hand shook with frustration, but he refused to stop. He treated each mistake like a cut on his soul, painful, but a lesson. The village children laughed when they saw him muttering foreign words by the river. They called him Old Warrior Chasing Wind. Hiroshi only bowed. He knew the wind was not to be caught, but understood. By nightfall, his body was tired, but his spirit stayed calm. Before sleeping, he repeated the words he had learned that day, speaking them into the silence of his room. He felt foolish, but inside that foolishness was growth. In his dreams, English letters danced like ghosts on the walls of his mind. He reached out, not to chase them, but to walk beside them. For Hiroshi, discipline was not punishment. It was a quiet promise to continue, even when no one was watching. The next morning, he would rise again before the sun and begin the same ritual: breath, sword, word, until all three moved as one. The path of repetition. Weeks turned into months. The air grew warmer, and the sound of cicadas filled the evenings. Hiroshi's progress was slow, but steady like water wearing down stone. Each day, he studied beneath a pine tree outside the village, his sword resting beside his notebooks. To him, the sword and the book were brothers. Both demanded stillness before movement. He began with simple words: sun, water, stone, wind. He wrote them 100 times each. His calligraphy brush moved with the same care he gave to his sword strikes. When he made an error, he did not curse. He simply bowed his head and began again. This was the discipline he had learned from years of martial training. Not to fight failure, but to respect it. Hiroshi did not chase fast learning. He built his knowledge like a temple, one stone a day. Sometimes he would close his eyes and repeat a phrase until it sank into his memory. The repetition was a kind of meditation. His breathing slowed. His heartbeat matched the rhythm of his voice. At noon, he practiced sword forms. The village boys sometimes came to watch. They whispered about his strange lessons, half sword, half foreign language. But when Hiroshi's blade cut through the air, they fell silent. The power behind his movements came from patience, not anger. Even in silence, they could feel it. The strength of someone who had mastered himself. When the sun dipped low, Hiroshi read from a worn grammar book he had received from a traveler. The pages smelled of rain and sea. The rules were difficult, tangled like branches, yet he found beauty in their order. Each sentence was a structure to be built with precision. He practiced writing small essays about honor, courage, and calm. His sentences were simple, his mistakes many, but the spirit behind them was pure. He did not seek praise or understanding. He sought mastery through humility. One evening, a storm came without warning. Wind tore through the trees. Rain hammered the earth. Hiroshi sat inside his small house, a candle burning low, reading aloud from his book. The storm raged outside, but he did not stop. He spoke each word carefully, letting the sound of thunder become part of his rhythm. When the candle finally died, he sat in darkness, repeating a single phrase he had just learned. "I will continue," he whispered again and again until the storm quieted. For him, language was not only about words. It was about endurance, the same endurance that shaped his spirit as a samurai. The next day, when the sun rose over the drenched fields, Hiroshi stepped outside, his clothes still damp, his eyes calm. The path of repetition had no end, but he no longer needed one. Each step, each sound was enough. The weight of patience. Autumn came softly to the valley. The rice fields turned gold, and mist clung to the mountains like memory. Hiroshi's studies continued through the changing season. His discipline did not bend, even as his body aged and his joints stiffened with the chill. He now wrote short passages in English about his daily life, about the taste of morning tea, the sound of rain on his roof, the feel of his sword in his hands. The sentences were plain, but honest. He was learning not only a new language, but a new way of seeing. Each word forced him to slow down, to notice the shape of thought before it became sound. Sometimes frustration crept in like a shadow. The rules of English still tangled his mind. The sounds were strange. His tongue stumbled, yet he smiled at his clumsiness. He remembered his first years of sword training, when his strikes had been wild, his balance poor. Perfection was never born in a day. It grew from 1,000 mistakes, each one cut and polished by patience. Every morning, he reviewed old lessons before adding new ones. He spoke each word with intention, as though it carried the weight of his ancestors. When fatigue came, he closed his eyes and breathed until the tension left his shoulders. Patience, he told himself, was sharper than steel. One afternoon, while walking by the river, Hiroshi found a fallen leaf shaped like a small hand. He held it gently and whispered the English word he had learned. Leaf. The sound was soft, almost fragile. He repeated it until it became part of him. He began to notice how words could hold life, not as weapons or tools, but as quiet companions. In the evenings, he lit a lantern and read aloud from his notes. The flickering light danced across the paper, and the air filled with the echo of foreign syllables. His voice was calm and deliberate, his posture straight. He treated every session as if his teacher stood beside him, watching in silence. When mistakes appeared, he did not cross them out. He circled them instead, studying each one as a craftsman studies a flaw in wood. The imperfection taught him where his attention must go. His notebooks became a map of effort, lines, corrections, repetitions, a visible record of persistence. As the harvest ended, villagers prepared for festivals. They invited Hiroshi, but he often declined, preferring the quiet company of his books. To some, he seemed distant, but to him, solitude was a forge where discipline was tempered. One night, as the first frost settled over the land, Hiroshi wrote a short phrase in English. The sword and the word are the same. He stared at the line for a long time. In that moment, he understood both demanded control, balance, and respect. One cut through flesh, the other through ignorance. He placed his brush down, folded his hands, and bowed to the paper. The room was silent, but inside that silence lived the sound of progress. Winter of resolve. The winter that followed was harsh. Snow fell thick over the roofs, and the mountain paths vanished beneath white silence. The cold bit into Hiroshi's fingers, making it painful to hold his brush. Still, he wrote. He wrapped his hands in cloth, sat close to the small fire, and copied sentences by the dim light. The smoke stung his eyes, but he refused to stop. He practiced pronunciation aloud, his breath turning to mist in the air. Each word emerged slowly, shaped with care. His voice was soft but steady. When fatigue pressed on him, he remembered the winters of his youth, long nights of sword drills, when his master had made him strike the same motion thousands of times in freezing air. That memory reminded him that warmth was earned through effort. Discipline, Hiroshi believed, was not comfort. It was the art of standing firm while the world tried to push you down. The snow outside became his teacher. It fell endlessly, patient and silent, yet powerful enough to reshape the land. He sought to learn from it, how to persist without noise. Each day he set a small goal. One day he learned 5 new words. The next, he read a short passage from a travel journal. The progress was quiet, but it built layer upon layer, like snow piling on the rooftops. He could feel the change within himself. His thoughts began forming in 2 languages now, his mind moving between them like water between stones. Sometimes he wrote letters to no one, just to test his skill. He would begin with simple greetings, then write about the weather, the mountains, his sword. His grammar was imperfect, yet every letter carried sincerity. These pages became his secret garden of growth. At night, the wind howled through cracks of his home, but Hiroshi's spirit did not bend. He read old poems translated into English, tracing connection between his language and this new one. He saw how both sought to describe the same truths: time, honor, nature, the fragility of life. The distance between words felt smaller with each line. One evening, his candle burned low, and the flame flickered like a heartbeat. Hiroshi closed his book and whispered a single thought: discipline makes even silence speak. He understood that discipline was not just about doing. It was about being constant, being mindful, being honest in effort. When the moon rose high, he stepped outside, snow crunching under his feet. The world was white and endless. He drew his sword and practiced slow movements beneath the pale sky. Each swing matched the rhythm of the English phrases he had learned. His body and mind worked together, language flowing like breath. In that frozen night, Hiroshi felt peace. The world was vast, his knowledge still small, but his path was clear. He would not stop until both sword and language moved with equal grace, until every word carried the same weight as a blade. Part 5. The Season of Balance. When spring returned, it came like a slow breath after long silence. The snow melted into streams, and the sound of water filled the air again. Hiroshi felt the same renewal inside himself. The long winter had carved patience into his bones, and his mind was sharper, calmer, more precise. He began each morning as always, rising before dawn, bowing to the east, practicing his kata. But now, after his sword forms, he read aloud from his English text in the open air. The cool breeze carried his voice through the pines. Words that had once felt foreign now moved with rhythm. His pronunciation was still rough, yet there was music in his tone, shaped by persistence. He studied grammar like he once studied combat, examining the structure, the purpose behind every move. He noticed how English sentences balanced themselves, how one phrase supported another like a fighter adjusting his stance. He wrote notes comparing swordsmanship and language, seeing patterns that few others might notice. At midday, he walked through the village to gather supplies. The townsfolk greeted him kindly, though they still whispered about his strange studies. To them, he was a relic of an older time, yet they respected his discipline. The children followed him, curious, asking to see his sword. He smiled and said nothing, but sometimes he handed them paper instead of steel, showing them the letters he practiced. A few began copying them beside him under the shade of the pine. Teaching, even without words, taught him more about patience. He realized that mastery was not the end of the path, but the sharing of it. Watching small hands struggle with foreign shapes reminded him of his own beginning, the trembling strokes of his first lessons. In the evenings, Hiroshi began translating his favorite poems from his own language into English. He worked slowly, weighing each word as if it were a stone on a scale. Some meanings could not be carried across. They stayed behind like shadows. Yet he found joy in the attempt. It was not about perfection, but about bringing two worlds closer through effort. The cherry blossoms began to fall, drifting like soft snow. Hiroshi often stood beneath the trees after study, letting petals gather on his shoulders. He whispered English words to what he saw: petal, wind, beauty, change. The words were small, but they carried great truth. He wrote them in his notebook, knowing that one day they would form part of a greater thought. As spring deepened, he noticed a calm rhythm in everything he did. The line between practice and life blurred. His sword was no longer separate from his language, and his language no longer separate from his spirit. Both had become reflections of the same discipline, the art of control through devotion. One evening, while writing by lamplight, he realized he had not felt frustration for many days. The work was still hard, but he no longer fought it. He accepted difficulty as a companion, not an enemy. This, he thought, was the true meaning of balance, not ease, but harmony between struggle and peace. When the lamp finally dimmed, he placed his brush aside, bowed to the paper, and whispered, "Thank you, teacher." He did not mean any person. He meant the path itself, the discipline that had never left his side, the pilgrimage of effort. By summer, Hiroshi's name had become a quiet legend in the nearby villages. Travelers passing through spoke of an old samurai who studied the Western tongue as if it were a sacred art. Some came to watch him practice, thinking they might witness a secret method of strength. Instead, they found a man sitting beneath a tree, repeating simple words with the focus of a monk. Hiroshi paid no mind to their curiosity. He had learned long ago that the opinions of others were like clouds. They passed without changing the sky. His attention belonged to the work, the slow construction of skill brick by brick. One morning, he set out on a short journey to the coast. He carried only his sword, his notebook, and a few rice cakes. He wished to hear the sounds of the sea, the same sea that had carried the language he studied from distant lands. The road was long and quiet, lined with fields and stone shrines. He walked at a steady pace, his thoughts calm and measured. Along the way, he practiced silently, forming English sentences in his mind as he had once planned strikes in combat. The rhythm of his steps matched the rhythm of the words. Each mile became a verse of learning, each breath a reminder of purpose. When he reached the shore, the vastness of the ocean filled him with humility. He watched the waves crash and retreat, endless and patient. This, he thought, is how discipline moves, not in bursts but in steady return. He sat on a flat rock and opened his notebook. The wind tugged at the pages, but he wrote anyway, pressing his palm against the paper to keep it steady. He described what he saw in simple English. The sea is strong. The sea is quiet. It comes and goes without end. The sentences were plain, yet true. He smiled at their honesty. There was no need for perfection when meaning was pure. Each day by the sea, he practiced reading aloud. Fishermen nearby listened to his steady voice, strange but calm. They could not understand his words, but they felt the discipline behind them, the same stillness they sought when facing the tides. At sunset, Hiroshi performed his sword kata on the wet sand. His reflection stretched across the shore, moving with precision and grace. The waves touched his feet, erased his footprints, and returned again. He saw in that cycle the heart of all learning. Effort followed by renewal, struggle followed by understanding. After a week, he turned back toward the mountains. He felt lighter, though he carried the same few belongings. The sea had taught him something the books could not. That mastery was not about conquering knowledge, but flowing with it. Like the tide, it demanded constancy, not control. When he reached his village again, the people noticed a quiet glow in his presence. He spoke little, but when he greeted them in both languages, his tone carried peace. They saw not an old warrior chasing strange words, but a man who had found harmony between the blade and the book. That evening, as cicadas sang in the trees, Hiroshi wrote his thought in English. Discipline is to see inside a man. He underlined it once, closed the book, and smiled at the truth that needed no translation. The quiet mastery. Years slipped away like shadows at dusk. Hiroshi's hair turned silver, his movements slower but no less deliberate. The village had changed, new houses, new faces, children grown into farmers and merchants. But Hiroshi remained constant, as though time respected his rhythm. His study of English had become more than a practice. It was a meditation woven into each day. He now read stories written in the language, pausing at every unfamiliar word, tasting it carefully before moving on. He translated his own poems into English and then back again, comparing how meaning shifted, how sound shaped thought. Each morning, before the village stirred, he swept the path to the shrine, then sat under the same pine tree where he had first practiced decades ago. His sword lay beside him, its edge still bright, though it had not been drawn in many years. To him, the sword and the language were equal forms of expression, one through silence, the other through sound. Sometimes, travelers stopped to rest near him. They asked in broken words what kept him studying for so long. Hiroshi would bow slightly and reply in simple English, because the path has no end. His voice carried neither pride nor weariness, only truth. His notebooks had grown thick, volumes filled with handwriting that traces grow from uncertain lines to steady script. He bound them carefully in cloth, placing them beside his sword at night. Together, they represented his two lives, the warrior and the student, both guided by the same discipline. In his later years, Hiroshi began teaching quietly. He never called himself a teacher, but those who sought his wisdom found it waiting in his patience. He showed them not only words or sword forms, but the attitude behind them, the calm awareness that turns repetition into art. When young men grew restless, he would remind them that haste is the enemy of strength. He taught that discipline was not about control over others, but mastery over the self. The sword cuts outward, he wrote one evening, but discipline cuts inward. His students copied the line again and again, though few truly understood until years later. One afternoon, during early autumn, a traveler from the west visited the village. He was surprised to hear an elderly samurai speak clear, careful English. They shared tea beneath the pine, exchanging words from both worlds. The traveler later said that Hiroshi's English was not perfect in grammar, but perfect in spirit. Every word chosen with the precision of a blade. After the visitor left, Hiroshi watched the path disappear into the trees. He felt gratitude, not pride, for the long years that had shaped him. His heart was light, his mind still curious. That night he wrote in his notebook, "Discipline is a bridge between what we are and what we seek." He placed his brush down, closed his eyes, and listened to the wind move through the pine. It spoke softly, like a whisper from all his years of effort. He smiled, knowing the sound by heart. The final lesson. The final winter of Hiroshi's life arrived without warning. Snow came early, soft and deep, and the village fell quiet beneath its white weight. He moved slower now, his steps careful, his breath shallow, yet his routine did not change. Every dawn, he still bowed to the east, lit a small fire, and opened his worn notebook. His eyes were weaker, his hand trembled, but his spirit remained unbroken. The words on the page looked blurred, but he knew them by memory. He whispered the phrases he had once struggled to pronounce, his voice a faint echo of his younger self. Each sound carried years of patience, as though the language had become part of his blood. He no longer chased new lessons. Instead, he reviewed what he had learned, polishing each phrase like a blade before rest. His focus was no longer on progress, but on presence, the act of being fully in the moment, of doing something with care even when the end was near. Villagers visited him more often now, bringing food and company. Children sat by his fire as he traced letters in the air, teaching them the beauty of slow learning. They laughed when they mispronounced words, and he smiled gently, reminding them that laughter itself was a kind of courage. He told them that discipline was not about perfection, but about returning to the work, the breath, the promise to continue. His lessons were simple, but his students remembered them like sacred verses. One evening, as the snow fell silently outside, Hiroshi opened his oldest notebook. The first pages were uneven, marked with hesitant lines, shaky letters, and small notes written beside them in his native tongue. He traced them with his finger and felt the passage of decades between those lines. On the last page, he wrote slowly, carefully, one final sentence in English. Discipline is to walk until a road becomes you. He placed his brush down and watched the ink dry. The room was dim, the air still. Outside, wind moved through the trees as it had on every morning of his life. He closed the notebook, sat beside his sword, and bowed deeply to his teachers, his language, his failures, and his perseverance. That night, Hiroshi rested quietly. When morning came, the villagers found him seated by the window, the first light of dawn touching his face. His hands were folded in peace, his notebook open to the final page. They buried him beneath the pine tree, where he had studied for so many years. His sword and his writings were placed beside him, two reflections of one discipline. Over time, the tree grew taller, its roots deep in the earth, its branches stretching toward the rising sun. Travelers who passed through the valley sometimes stopped to rest there. They found, carved into a simple wooden stone, words in English and Japanese alike. Through patience the spirit endures. The wind carried those words softly down the valley, and the echo of the samurai's discipline lived on, not in the sharpness of his blade, but in the quiet strength of his learning, endless as the dawn. Hiroshi's journey teaches us that learning English and improving ourselves require patience, practice, and discipline. Just as he trained his sword and his mind every day, we must practice English consistently, speaking, listening, reading, and writing, even when it feels difficult. Mistakes are part of the journey. Every word you mispronounce, every sentence you rewrite, helps you grow stronger and more confident. Discipline is not about perfection. It is about returning to your work day after day, learning from effort, and never giving up. By following Hiroshi's example, you can see that learning a language is also a path to becoming a better person. Small, steady steps build skill, confidence, and character. Keep practicing, stay patient, and respect your own progress. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story and want more lessons like this, don't forget to subscribe and continue learning with us. Keep practicing, stay motivated, and let every day bring you closer to mastery in English and in life.